Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video and welcome to another Trollope Thursday. And today I'm going to be doing a slightly different video and pulling together all of my reviews of Anthony Trollope's 47 novels over the past 10.5 years. So, over the past 10.5 years, I have been reading the works of Anthony Trollope, and I have now read all 47 of his novels. And while I have been making a lot of videos about Anthony Trollope over the past few weeks, not all of Anthony Trollope's novels are as fresh in my mind as others. But I have been making videos on this channel for a good 11 years now, and I have reviewed all of Anthony Trollope's novels at various stages in the past 10.5 years in wrap-up videos where I review everything I read in a month. And I thought that it might be helpful to pull together all of my like mini reviews from my reading wrap-ups over the past 10.5 years whenever I read an Anthony Trollope novel. So in this video, what you're going to see is 47 clips of me talking about an Anthony Trollope novel when I had just finished it. So we're going to go from October 2015, when I first read The Warden by Anthony Trollope, right up to April 2026, when I read John Caldigate by Anthony Trollope, my final Anthony Trollope novel. Obviously, the rest of this video is going to be clips that have appeared on my channel before, but I thought it might be helpful to have all of my Anthony Trollope reviews in one place, so that if you're looking for a quick introduction to an Anthony Trollope novel, you can skim through this video and find the book you're looking for. I'm not expecting that many people will watch this video all the way through, and obviously some of you who have been watching my channel for a while may have already seen these clips in the videos they originally appeared in, but I thought it might be helpful to have this video as a bit of a directory. So in the description, I will have all of Anthony Trollope's novels listed with timestamps where you can find the reviews. I've ordered the video clips in this video just in the order that I read Anthony Trollope's books, but in the description I will list his works in alphabetical order by title, so that it's easier to find the book you're looking for if you're just here looking for a particular book. As I said, within this video you will find reviews for all 47 of Anthony Trollope's novels. There are 3 Anthony Trollope novels that I first read before I started a booktube channel, that I read as a teenager. So those 3 novels: The Way We Live Now, He Knew Who Was Right, and Rachel Ray. The review in this video is a reread review, as it were, but all the rest are my initial first impressions of first reading that book by Anthony Trollope. If you do want to stick around and watch this whole video, then, you know, feel free. You can watch me age 10.5 years in 2 hours, which is surreal. I personally quite enjoyed watching through all of these clips again, partly because it's really nice to see me 10 years ago being like, oh, maybe I'd like to read all the works of Anthony Trollope, but he wrote 47 books, it'll take me a while. And now I have done that, which is really cool. But also it's interesting looking back on my immediate thoughts after I finished an Anthony Trollope novel, because there are some Anthony Trollope novels that I spoke much more highly of than I was expecting, and some that I didn't speak as highly of as I was expecting. Dr. Wortle School is now one of my absolute favourite Anthony Trollope novels, not just because I've reread it recently, but because it's a novel that I think about all the time and that I really love and came to value. But watching my initial review about it, I was positive about it, but I wasn't as enthusiastic about it as I was about other Anthony Trollope novels. And it was really interesting watching back my initial review of Can You Forgive Her. I had forgotten how much I loved Can You Forgive Her. In my mind, Can You Forgive Her has become like a 4-star Trollope, but immediately after I read it, I was raving about how amazing it was. You know, that clearly means I need to reread it. So it's been quite fun watching back through the clips. It is a bit infuriating to me, 10 years on, that early 20s Katie cannot distinguish between Barsetshire and Barchester and just uses them interchangeably. Though in the Barsetshire Chronicles, Barchester is like the county capital of the county Barsetshire. Barchester is the cathedral city, Barsetshire is the county, but I did not know that when I first started reading Anthony Trollope's books, as is very apparent from these clips. Obviously, some of the first clips are 10 years old, so the sound quality is less good, and I find the way I used to talk on camera really weird. I feel like my voice is just really different now, but there we go. They're still hopefully interesting reviews, and they give you all my initial thoughts just after I finish reading an Anthony Trollope novel. I will stop rambling now and we'll go back to October 2015.
The next
next classic I read is The Warden by Anthony Trollope. This novel follows the story of a clergyman who is appointed to be a warden over a kind of almshouse hospital place. He gets paid a fairly decent salary to keep an eye on the inmates of the hospital, and he is perfectly happy and content until someone questions his right to the money and whether or not the salary should be going to him, or whether or not the money that was left to this institution in a will a very long time ago should actually be going to the inmates of the hospital, not the warden. I hope that makes sense. It sounds like quite a convoluted premise, I know, but it is a book that is quite ingrained in like church politics of the 19th century. It's also a lot about like morality and conscience and the difference between being like legally right and wrong and morally right and wrong. I really enjoyed it, but I don't think it's a good place to start with Anthony Trollope, and I don't think it's a good place to start with Victorian literature. This book, as someone that loves Victorian literature and history and is really interested in all of like the stuff going on at the time, I really enjoyed. But I think if you haven't read that much Victorian literature, or you're not that interested in the Victorian period's history in general, you might find this a bit dry. There are some Victorian novels which age incredibly well and which tell stories which feel universal and relevant today, like I think Jane Eyre and like some of Dickens' novels, but this is very much a Victorian novel. It is entirely bound up in issues which are no longer as important. A lot of the kind of morality things it deals with are quite timeless, but because it is so bound up in church politics, it is a very, very Victorian novel, and I think it's only for someone who loves Victorian literature and the Victorian period a lot. However, I do very much recommend the other three Anthony Trollope novels I have read, which I think age better, which are The Way We Live Now, He Knew He Was Right, and Rachel Ray. And I really want to read more by Anthony Trollope because he does have a wonderful writing style. Now, the other classic I read this month was Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, which was just glorious. My favourite book of the month, definitely, and I'm sure it will be one of my favourite books of the year. I love Anthony Trollope. He is a wonderful, wonderful Victorian writer, and I do feel sometimes a bit underrated. This is the second book in the Barchester Chronicles. I read The Warden back in October of last year, and I liked it, but it wasn't my favourite Trollope so far, and it wasn't as good as the other standalone Trollope novels which I have read, but I wanted to carry on with the series as a lot of people say that Barchester Towers is their favourite, or that The Warden is their least favourite. The Barchester Chronicles are set in a town called Barchester and basically explores the relationships between the clergy and the church politics within these towns. The Warden I enjoyed it, but some of the church politics is a little bit dry and at times a bit hard to follow, and I think it's the kind of book that you would only like if you're really into the Victorians. Barchester Towers, however, is more entertaining, more deep, more fully realised. And although there is a lot of church politics in it, like it is a book that is in many ways about high church versus low church within the Victorian English society, but it's done through the characters and the characterisation, and the characters that he draws are so strong, and some of the romantic plot lines and the family relationships in here are just wonderful. I loved it so much. I was sat on the tube grinning to myself at the end of it, and it was just beautiful. All in all, I thoroughly love this, and I'm really excited to read the next one in the Barchester Chronicles. First book I finished in October was Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope. This is the third book in the Barchester Chronicles, the first two being The Warden and Barchester Towers. Dr. Thorne is about a man called Dr. Thorne and his niece Mary Thorne, who he looks after, and it basically follows the love story of Mary Thorne and that family's relationship with a nearby other family, the Greshams. Now, the Greshams are a very sort of high-born family, though their fortunes have been steadily declining. They have aristocratic relatives, but they're not actually that rich, and so their great desire is for their son, Frank Gresham, to marry someone of wealth. Frank, however, is a bit more keen on Mary Thorne. Now, Mary Thorne does not have much money, and her birth is of dubious origin, shall we say, so that is where sort of the main drama of Dr. Thorne comes to. The book is a lot about Mary Thorne's relationship with Frank, but it's also about her relationship with her uncle and the way that her uncle kind of deals with this conflict between the families. Now, there are a lot of things about Dr. Thorne that I did love. As always, I think Anthony Trollope's writing is really nice, really enjoyable, and I think he draws characters so well. I also really enjoyed the social and cultural themes that were in there, especially to do with Mary's birth and what that might mean, and the various ideas brought up in this book about kind of birth versus money in terms of class. There's one character who was born working class but has become an aristocrat through being knighted, and he has an awful lot of money, but the way that people who are born high but have less money than him treat him is quite interesting, and that kind of dynamic is very fascinating and something in Victorian history that I'm really interested in, so I really liked all of that. I think the thing that I didn't like as much about Dr. Thorne was just that I found the love story quite conventional, and I found the ending a bit irritating. Like,
there are a lot of people that seem to be forgiven that I didn't feel should be forgiven. One of the things I really love about Anthony Trollope is that I feel his novels tend to be really, really different from a lot of other Victorian literature. Like, the reason why I think Barchester Towers or The Way We Live Now or He Knew He Was Right are so brilliant is because they all deal with a lot of themes that aren't often dealt with, or they're just really, really different. They have unconventional plots, or they have unconventional central heroines or heroes, and there's something really, really different about them. And the thing I always love about Anthony Trollope is that his novels are not conventionally Victorian, and they don't follow all the tropes of other Victorian novels. Dr. Thorne, for me, I really enjoyed it, but it just felt a bit more conventional and less original and different. And I get that Anthony Trollope is trying to make Dr. Thorne the hero rather than the young people, but actually for me it felt like it was a book about Mary Thorne and Frank Gresham. I was enjoying it all the time I was reading it, but when I finished it I felt a little bit disappointed because it didn't quite live up to the rest of Trollope for me, because it was just a bit less exciting, less original, a bit more flat. I still liked it, I still enjoyed it, but it wasn't quite as good as Barchester Towers. No, it wasn't as good. Next, I read Framley Parsonage by Anthony Trollope. This is the fourth book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, which I have been buddy reading with Caroline from BBC Girl 520, and I'll link her down below. I absolutely love the Barsetshire Chronicles. One of the things I really like about them is that although it's a series, it's kind of more like a series of interconnected novels than it is a set series. Though they share a lot of the same minor characters, they don't share the same major characters, and they're just sort of set roughly in the same area, and a lot of people like crop up from other books, which I really love. I really love Framley Parsonage a lot. I think it's probably my second favourite of the series so far. I think Barchester Towers still beats it slightly for me. The book follows a character called Mark Roberts, who is the vicar of a place called Framley, and Mark has been good friends for a long time with the local squire, Lord Lufton, and also has to an extent, good relationship with Lord Lufton's mother, Lady Lufton. And Mark is a young man, and although he is a clergyman, that doesn't necessarily mean that he is automatically more moral and more amiable than all the rest of the men around him. He makes friends with some people that he possibly shouldn't make friends with, gets caught up in some of his friends' like debt problems, and everything kind of spirals from there in a really interesting way. The book also deals with Mark's sister, Lucy Robert, who comes to live with him, and her relationship with Lord Lufton. I think Anthony Trollope's writing is so good. I love his writing so much. Dickens is my favourite author, obviously, and one of the things I love about Dickens is how like insane some of his writing is. How sometimes it just feel like he's just like exploded all the words onto the page, and sometimes they're quite messy and disorderly. I kind of love that. It's something I really enjoy about Dickens. And one of the things I enjoy about Trollope, in contrast to Dickens, I suppose, is that Trollope's writing feels very calm and organised. It doesn't feel like overly crafted. It just feels like he was like writing very calmly and very slowly and just like getting out everything he needed to say in a nice, neat, ordered manner, which is sometimes quite enjoyable to read. I thought the characterisation was brilliant, and the themes the book explores, especially to do with like the role of clergymen within Victorian society, was really, really good. Simultaneously, he is criticising Victorian society for the fact that they assume clergymen are not human and are like magically more moral than everybody else, and that they should be held to a much higher standard than everybody else, that they assume that they have no flaws. But it also criticises Victorian society for immoral acts that they think are kind of okay to do, but actually they would consider immoral if a clergyman did them. So it's very, very interesting in that sense. I think the thing I really liked about Framley Parsonage is that it had all the like church politics and interesting, unusual plot that Barchester Towers has, but it also had like the nice love story element of Dr. Thorne, and it has quite a similar love story present in it to Dr. Thorne. And I think what I really loved about it is just that it's really different. Like, I read lots of Victorian literature, and a lot of Victorian literature features a 19-year-old female heroine, and you know, like, I love North and South and Our Mutual Friend, and I love their 19-year-old female heroines. I have no problem with them, but sometimes it's really nice to read a Victorian novel where the main hero is a like 27-year-old married clergyman who has 2 young children, because you don't get that very much in Victorian literature, and that's just really nice. It's very refreshing, and that's something I love about Anthony Trollope's work, how unique and interesting he is. It made me realise, reading Framley Parsonage, that I would like to read everything by Anthony Trollope, which is quite a tall order. It's more ambitious than trying to read everything by Charles Dickens or Hardy or Gaskell or Jane Austen, which I've done because they all wrote like between 6 and 14 books, and that's kind of doable. Anthony Trollope wrote 46. However, I realise that if I read an Anthony Trollope book every other month for the next 7 years, I will, at the end of that 7 years, have read everything by Anthony Trollope. So yes, that's my current plan. This month I read The Small House at Allington by Anthony Trollope, which is the 5th book in the Barsetshire Chronicles, and I buddy read this with Caroline from BBC Girl. And this was absolutely brilliant. This is probably my favourite book of the year so far that wasn't a reread. It was so good. It was just, oh, it was so good. I love Anthony Trollope so much. He writes so well, and the Barchester Chronicles are so wonderful and so rewarding because they're a series of interconnected novels and characters crop up who you've met a little bit before, but they're not, they all feel like individual stories. They don't follow on from each other directly. It's just that there are characters in common and places in common, and I love that. I think it's wonderful. The Small House at Allington is definitely my favourite in the series so far. It beats Barchester Towers for me. It can't quite be my favourite Anthony Trollope novel ever because The Way We Live Now is so good and is in like my top 10 books of all time, but it's second to that in terms of Anthony Trollope love, and it was so amazing. So to quickly explain a little bit about what The Small House at Allington is about. Allington is a village in the county of Barsetshire. There is a big house at Allington where the squire lives, and then there is a small house at Allington where the squire's nieces and their mother live. The book basically follows these two sisters, Lily and Belle Dale, and their relationships with men, their relationships with their mother and with their uncle, and how they get on in society, how everything goes with them. And then we also follow the four men, the four kind of heroes slash anti-heroes of this book, two of which are kind of interested in Belle and two of which are kind of interested in Lily. And it was just wonderful. It reminded me in some ways of Sense and Sensibility in the relationship between the two sisters and some of the action that plays out. We have Belle, the elder sister, who is much more reserved, much more quiet and sensible, and then we have Lily, who is much kind of more giddy and loud and playful and likes to tease everyone. And although she's less like directly romantic than Marianne in Sense and Sensibility, she does have this deep kind of romanticism in her. I love Sense and Sensibility a lot. I mean, it's my least favourite Austen, but I still love it a lot. But this was so much better and so much richer and more wonderful. It is such a sad and poignant and beautifully sad book, and it's not heartbreaking or bleak in the way Thomas Hardy is. It's not depressing sad, it's just like life sad, if you know what I mean. It's just the kind of sadness that feels very realistic, very poignant and very true to life. It is absolutely beautiful, and it is, yeah, it does feel to me like Sense and Sensibility, but how it would actually happen. I just found the book absolutely wonderful. I love the character of John Eames. John Eames is like my new favourite Anthony Trollope hero for being a wonderful, wonderful character. And all of the characters in this, Mr. Crosby, Dr. Cross, Bernard Dale, like, I think Anthony Trollope is so good at writing completely realistic characters, and that's one of the things I really like about him, and I know it's one of the things he prides himself on. He has lots of little digs in his novels about how Dickens is so like romanticised and melodramatic and over the top, and how he's definitely not, and he's very realistic, and it's kind of true. And I love the melodrama in Dickens, and I love the crazy eccentric characters that aren't quite true to life, but I also love reading Anthony Trollope for his complete realism and for characters that are utterly believable in kind of sometimes the worst ways. Like, you really don't want to believe this is how someone would behave, but you know they would. And the sadness in this book and how close to happiness moments get and fall short of is so poignant and beautiful, and it's just incredible. It's wonderfully written, beautiful character development, so engaging. It made me laugh, it made me like cry on a plane. It's just great. It's so good. I cannot recommend the Barchester Chronicles enough, and yeah, The Small House at Allington is my favourite. The one novel I did read in December was The Last Chronicle of Barset by Anthony Trollope. This is the last book in the Chronicles of Barchester series by Anthony Trollope, which I've been reading over the last 2 years, I suppose. If you don't know, the Chronicles of Barchester are a Victorian series of novels by Anthony Trollope, all set in the mythical county, the fictional county of Barsetshire. They're not so much sort of direct sequels to one another, but they have many characters that crop up in each other's books, and they're all set roughly in the same place, so that is some crossover between them. It's more like a series of 6 interlinking novels than it is a direct series, and in The Last Chronicle we get to meet a lot of characters that have turned up in previous novels and revisit them again. I absolutely thoroughly enjoyed this. It was absolutely wonderful and one of my real highlights of the year. I've loved the whole of the Chronicles of Barchester, and although the last book is not my favourite, the last book was what I wanted it to be, and fully met my expectations of being wonderful. The central plotline of it follows a family that we've encountered in a previous Barchester novel, and the father of this family, who is a clergyman, is accused of stealing a cheque of £20. The book explores how this affects the man's physical and mental health, and also how it affects the lives of his family and those around him. And then there are several other subplots which feature various other characters, some of which are entirely new for this book, and some of which you've encountered before in the previous Chronicles of Barchester. One of the things I quite like about Anthony Trollope is that his plots can be unconventional and unpredictable, and there were times in this book when I was on the edge of my seat and I really didn't know how particular subplots or plots were going to go. And I feel like Trollope did everything correct in this book. There were no decisions in this book that he made that I didn't want him to make, and there were some decisions that I really, really thought he was going to make in a way I didn't want him to, and then he didn't, and I was very, very happy. So I should have trusted Anthony Trollope more. It was an absolutely brilliant, brilliant book, and I would highly recommend the Chronicles of Barchester if you haven't yet picked them up. I also reread another absolute favourite classic of mine this month, and that is Anthony Trollope's The Way We Live Now. This was my third reading, but I haven't read it since I was about 18, so it was really, really lovely to reread it this month. Though it did take up most of my month because it is quite a long one. And I buddy read this with Amanda Center and Marissa from Blatantly Bookish. I'll link their channels down below. I think they're not quite finished as well, I'm filming this, but they are nearing the end, and it's been really lovely to discuss it with them, especially as this is my third reading and this is their first. I love this book an awful, awful lot. It is my favourite Anthony Trollope book, and I think it's so wonderful. It's kind of Dickensian in form in that we have a lot of characters and a lot of subplots, but the book kind of focuses around this fortune possessed by the Melmotte family. Mr. Melmotte turns up in London with a wife and a daughter and a lot of money, and no one knows where he's got his money from or where he's from or if he's got his money in a moral and legal fashion, but everyone flocks to them because they have money and they become the new kind of big thing in society. And it's about Mr. Melmotte and his kind of capitalist ventures, but it's also about his daughter and the men who want to marry her, and it's also about a family called the Carberries, Lady Carberry and her son and daughter Felix and Hetta, and so many other characters. It's really, really wonderful. I find the way it deals with like Victorian capitalism and money and sort of class versus respectability and issues of marriage and duty and women and men's position within society really, really interesting. I love Anthony Trollope's writing. I love the realism of his characters, and yeah, this was such a joy to reread, and I have decided that I think it is my favourite novel by Anthony Trollope over The Small House Allington. I love The Small House Allington, but I think this is a slightly more ambitious novel in a way, and I find the stuff it has to say about money so interesting and so fascinating, and that's why I love it so much. This month I finally got round to starting Anthony Trollope's Palliser series and read Can You Forgive Her, which is the first book in the series. So the Palliser series, like the Barchester Chronicles, which I've read before, are a series of like interconnected novels, and some of the characters in the Palliser series do also connect to some of the characters in the Barchester Chronicles, just for extra interconnected joy, because Anthony Trollope is glorious. This book was absolutely incredible. I loved it so much. I am really coming round to loving Anthony Trollope an awful, awful lot. I'm not saying that he would beat Dickens or Jane Austen or Elizabeth Gaskell, who are my favourite three authors, but he's up there. He's like number 4. I like him quite a lot, and I really need to get on and read some more Anthony Trollope because I would love to read everything by him, and he wrote nearly 50 books and I've only read 11. This book, Can You Forgive Her, which I should probably stop holding up because it's probably creating weird glare effects because it's a library copy and very shiny, but this book, Can You Forgive Her, is absolutely amazing. It follows chiefly a young woman called Alice Vavasor, who at the very beginning of the book is engaged, but she's starting to have some doubts about whether or not the man she's engaged to would really suit her. She loves him, she admires him, she respects him, but he is quite quiet and solitary and wants to live a kind of quiet, calm country life, and that is not perhaps what Alice wants. She is a bit more ambitious. And then she also starts to spend a little bit more time with a young man called George, who she used to be engaged to, and everything kind of goes on from there. And the basic premise of the book, the title Can You Forgive Her, is can you, as a reader, forgive Alice for the way she behaved in this book? But actually, although Alice is the her specifically referred to in the title, there are several other characters in this book that are requiring forgiveness as well. And one of my favourite characters in this book, actually, a woman who, like Alice, makes quite a lot of mistakes, is a woman called Lady Glencora. And I thought her plotline was done really, really, really well. I also love Mr. Palliser. Mr. Palliser is a wonderful, wonderful character. Anthony Trollope is brilliant at writing about politics, of which there is quite a lot in this book. But he's also brilliant at writing about family relationships and love and marriage, and very, very brilliant at writing about marriages of people who perhaps shouldn't really be married and are not very well suited to each other, but have to kind of get by and make something of it anyway. I think he is a really, really, really talented writer, and just like I can't recommend this enough. I did feel that the ending was a little bit too long. Like there was one plotline in particular that I felt was like wrapped up and done really brilliantly and then kind of like carried on for another 100 pages. But in the spirit of forgiveness, which this book encourages, I don't care, because the characterization is so strong, the writing's so good, so funny, so witty, so marvellously entertaining, but also so moving and poignant at times. Like, Anthony Trollope is just a master storyteller, and I can't wait to read everything by him. And then the final book I finished in Victober was Dr. Wortle's School by Anthony Trollope. You may notice that this was not on my TBR. I was planning on reading Phineas Finn, but I swapped it out for Dr. Wortle's School instead. I really enjoyed this one, and I think I may have finally found a novel that I can recommend when people say, where should I start with Anthony Trollope? Because it is not part of a series and also quite short, which both stands in its favour. Dr. Wortle's School is a really interesting novel, and one I really liked. It was also, for the Victorian period, it's quite a brave book to write, which I think is really cool and just reminds me of many reasons why I love Anthony Trollope. It looks at this man called Dr. Wortle. He is a clergyman and he runs a school for boys, and at this school there is a kind of deputy teacher called Mr. Peacock who is there with his wife. But Mr. and Mrs. Peacock have a secret. And I'm going to tell you what the secret is, because Anthony Trollope tells you, like, within the first few chapters, and he goes on like a long tangent about how if he was a different writer, then he wouldn't tell you until the very end and there would all be lots of drama and revelation, but that's not the point here. The point is to look at how this thing affects everybody else. So I'm going to tell you, but if you really don't want to know anything about the book and you don't want to know what you find out like a few chapters in, then, you know, this is the last book I'm talking about today. The secret is that Mr. and Mrs. Peacock are not legally married. She is American. They met over in America and she was married then to another man. He, after the Civil War, was believed dead, after which she married Mr. Peacock, and then, of course, her assumed dead husband turned up again, but her and Mr. Peacock stayed together and moved together to England to continue living together as man and wife, although legally they are not. And this, like for the Victorian period, is very scandalous, and the way the book looks at how Dr. Wortle kind of reacts to this and everyone around them in the neighbourhood is just really, really interesting, really powerful, and just so well done. I thought it was such a fantastic and engaging read. Not like my absolute favourite Anthony Trollope, but definitely a really good one and a really great one to start with, I think. It also reminded me in many ways of The Warden, because both of them, I suppose, look at someone being tested by a moral decision they hadn't really thought of before, I suppose, and also both of them address kind of the peculiar circumstances of clergymen within the Victorian period and how they're kind of expected to be more moral than those around them, which I found really, really interesting. Would definitely recommend Dr. Wortle's School. It was a great Anthony Trollope and quite a short one as well, only sort of 200 pages, and most of his are about 1,000, so that's pretty good going. Another Victorian book I read in January was Phineas Finn by Anthony Trollope. This is the second book in the Palliser series and is the first book I read for my Trollope project, which is going throughout 2019, in which I'm aiming to read a book by Anthony Trollope every month. So Phineas Finn tells the story of a young man called Phineas Finn. He's Irish, but he comes to London to study law, and then he is encouraged to stand for Parliament. And so the book kind of follows his parliamentary career and his kind of relationship with various different women who he falls in and out of love with, and also the kind of various characters that surround them and the various plot lines that go on. I really, really enjoyed this. I think Phineas Finn, the main character in this, a bit like Alice, the main character in Can You Forgive Her, sometimes makes very bad decisions, but you also sympathise with Phineas and you also understand him. I really enjoyed the Parliament and kind of party politics in this. I thought that was really interesting, and from a historical perspective as well as just from a narrative perspective. And I thought there were so many engaging characters in this. I loved Violet. I loved Lady Laura too. Lady Laura was fascinating, and her plotline I felt was one of the strongest in this book. Really, really compelling and interesting. I also liked Lord Chiltern. I thought he was really well done. There were just so many interesting characters in this, and like always, Trollope's writing was just wonderful and so enjoyable. Another thing I quite liked in this, though a minor thing, is like it's quite common in Victorian literature to have a female character who is really, really good looking and therefore like everybody loves and they kind of get on better in life. But I don't think it's often that I've read a Victorian book with a male character who is quite defined by their looks and whose people react to because of their looks. But in this book, Phineas Finn is like really good looking, and that means that's one of the reasons why he kind of gets on in Parliament and everybody seems to like him. And even like his landlady, who's like 20 years older than him, is a little bit in love with him, which I just found quite funny and I thought was quite nicely done and was nice because it's a bit refreshing because you don't often find male characters in Victorian literature as defined by their looks as female characters. Anyway, a really good read. I love Anthony Trollope a lot. This was great fun. So the first book I read in February was Cousin Henry by Anthony Trollope. As some of you will know from my goals video, this year I am doing what I'm calling the Trollope Project, where I'm reading a novel by Anthony Trollope every month because he's one of my favourite Victorian authors, an author I absolutely love, and I just want to read more of his work. So this month I read Cousin Henry. Cousin Henry is one of those very interesting Victorian novels that sort of looks at inheritance. We begin the book with a landowner in Wales. He's fairly wealthy and he has a niece and a nephew, no children of his own. And he is kind of torn between his love of tradition and his love of his niece. He believes in his heart in primogeniture, in the male line inheriting, and he thinks that it would be the correct and right thing to do for his nephew Henry to inherit the estate. However, he also kind of hates his nephew Henry, and he loves and adores his niece Isabel, so he is kind of torn between his affection and what he perceives to be his duty. And basically the book follows what happens after this man dies in the kind of dispute and inheritance troubles between Isabel and Henry. I found Cousin Henry a really interesting book, especially because it mostly focuses on Henry, not Isabel, and Henry is incredibly dislikable. But at the same time, although he is a dislikable character, you do have some sympathy for him in some ways, and he's still very, very interesting to read about. And it's very interesting and different that Anthony Trollope has chosen such a dislikable man for his kind of hero in some ways, or for his main character at least. But it was quite interesting to kind of look at these inheritance disputes and this kind of theme of duty versus affection within the Victorian mindset, which comes up in terms of how Indeffa Jones feels, but also in how Isabel feels. It's a really interesting book looking at a lot of interesting themes, and I really, really enjoyed it. This month I read The Eustace Diamonds by Anthony Trollope. This is the third book in the Balatka series and one that I really enjoyed. Anthony Trollope is one of my favourite authors, and as a lot of you will know, I'm setting myself a Trollope project this year where I'm reading a different book by Anthony Trollope every month. And The Eustace Diamonds follows a woman called Lizzie Eustace, who is married at a young age to a man who is not very well. He dies very shortly after their wedding, leaving her as a widow with a child, and also having given to her before his death a diamond necklace worth £10,000, which is a lot of money today and was even more money in the Victorian period, which may or may not be a family heirloom, and therefore his family dispute her right to have. And the book basically follows Lizzie and the diamonds and her relationship with her cousin Frank and various people around her. But what is quite fun about this book, and what made it very different and really entertaining, is that Lizzie is not a nice person at all. She reminded me a lot of Lady Susan from Jane Austen's Lady Susan, a younger Lady Susan, and perhaps a less wise Lady Susan. But if you enjoyed Lady Susan, you really must read The Eustace Diamonds, because it's very, very good fun, and Lizzie is not very nice. She is quite cunning and mercenary and lies a lot. As often is the case with Trollope, it's a big book with a lot of characters and a lot of plot and a lot of interest. I love his witty writing, and I love his characterisation and his plots and his dialogue, and he's just, yeah, he's one of my favourite writers. I enjoyed this one a lot. I did read one Victorian novel this month, and that was Miss Mackenzie by Anthony Trollope, and this was the book I read for my Trollope project, which I'm doing this year, where I try to read a novel by Anthony Trollope every month. This is an interesting novel of his. It is a standalone novel, and it follows a woman called Miss Mackenzie. She's in her mid-30s when her brother dies and leaves her a fortune, and she has never had any money before, and she's never had much of a life and many prospects. She has basically spent her life nursing her invalid brother and staying inside and not really speaking to very many people, and suddenly she finds herself a wealthy heiress in society with a lot of men suddenly wanting to marry her after no one had really shown much interest in doing so before. And it basically follows her and the various suitors around her, and is really good fun. One of my favourite things about Anthony Trollope is the fact that his books are often quite unique and quite different, and a lot of his novels don't follow a lot of Victorian conventions. It is not very common for a Victorian novel to take as its heroine a woman in her mid-30s, and that was nice. This is also just a really kind of tender and pleasant read as well. And another thing I enjoyed is that there is a little cameo of some of the characters from Anthony Trollope's Balatka series in here, which is quite fun too. May's Anthony Trollope read was this. This is Phineas Redux, which is the fourth book in the Balatka series, which is a series of interconnected novels based around Parliament in the Victorian period. Anthony Trollope is one of my favourite Victorian writers. This I really enjoyed, but it wasn't my favourite Anthony Trollope book. I would say, in fact, this is probably my least favourite of the Balatka novels so far. So this follows a character called Phineas Finn, who we also encountered in the second book in the series, Phineas Finn. I can't say too much about this plot without spoiling earlier books in the series, but it follows him, his adventures and experiences in Parliament, and all of the characters around him, including a lot of characters who were also in Can You Forgive Her and Phineas Finn and The Eustace Diamonds. The Balatka novels, like the Barchester Chronicles by Trollope, are a series of interconnected novels, but I will say that this one is pretty interconnected. Like, I don't think this book would make much sense to you if you hadn't read the three previous books in the series, and it also very heavily spoils the three previous books in the series. There are a lot of things in this that I found really interesting, and I would say that, like, from halfway to three quarters. The like third quarter in this book was fantastic, really dramatic, really exciting, but I found that it had quite a slow start and I didn't love the ending. It wasn't the ending that I wanted, which is rare in Trollope. And all the way through the book I was like, I can see this might be going one way, and then I was trying to remind myself to trust Trollope, and then I trust him as a writer to usually put his plots in the direction that I want them to, and it didn't really go in the direction that I wanted it to. So I didn't hate the ending. I kind of came to terms with it, but it wasn't the ending of the novel that I wanted in two different ways. So I liked it, but yeah, definitely not my favourite Anthony Trollope and definitely not my favourite Pulitzer so far. I read two Victorian novels this month. One was this is He Popenjoy by Anthony Trollope. This was my Trollope project pick for this month, so if you don't know, I am currently doing what I'm calling the Trollope Project, where every month this year I try to read a novel by Anthony Trollope, who's one of my favourite Victorian writers. This is a really interesting one, and one that I really enjoyed. Possibly one of my favourite Trollope books I've read this year, although the second half didn't quite live up to the first half. This follows a young woman called Mary who marries a man a little bit older than herself, who she doesn't know that well when they get married. She likes him, but she isn't yet in love with him, but she thinks that she can fall in love with him, which is why she marries him. And he really likes her, is a little bit in love with her, but not very in love with her. And the book follows their marriage and the relationship between their families, especially between Mary's father and George's brother. Because George is the younger brother of a marquis, and he would be due to inherit the title, and his children would be due to inherit the title because his brother is unmarried and doesn't have any children. Until just when George and Mary are about to get married, George's brother writes to him to say that he is also about to get married. And then a few months later turns up, says, actually, I've already been married for 2 years. Here is my 2-year-old son, who is Lord Popenjoy, heir to the estate. And the book kind of follows questions of legality and inheritance about whether or not this boy is a legitimate son and whether or not he is Lord Popenjoy, and also follows the kind of messy relationship between Mary and George. I really, really enjoyed this, especially like the first half to 2/3, which I thought was really, really strong. Like, in my opinion, the thing Anthony Trollope writes best about is marriages that aren't quite working. Like, some of my favourite books by him, and some of the books that I think are the most well done, like Can You Forgive Her or He Knew He Was Right, look at marriages that just aren't quite working and what's wrong with them. And I think that's something he does wonderfully, and something that I really like, and something that is done superbly in this book. The only issue I have with it is that the last like 200 pages really dragged, and a lot of the plot seemed to be resolved, and then there was still going on. And then there was like one subplot that only started in the last 200 pages and took up space and kind of felt like it didn't need to be in the book. So there were a lot of things I thought were brilliant about this, but the ending just dragged a little bit. So there were some things about this that I loved a lot, and there's a lot in it that I think is really fantastic, but there were just the one or two things that made it a kind of 4-star rather than 5-star read for me. And yeah, I would still really recommend this one. This month, my Anthony Trollope book was The Prime Minister. This is the 5th book in the Palace series, and my favourite so far, I think I'm going to say. I love this a lot. It was a really, really fantastic read. We follow various characters, including a man called Ferdinand Lopez, who wants to marry a particular woman whose father doesn't want him to marry that particular woman, and that's kind of one dramatic plotline going on. And then we also follow Mr. Palliser, who is a recurring character throughout the series, and his life and his marriage and his political career when he becomes the Prime Minister. This is really, really good. Definitely Trollope at his best. There are two things especially that I think Trollope does fantastically. One is writing about slightly dysfunctional marriages, and the other is writing about unrequited love. And both of those things are done brilliantly in this book, in a really wonderful way. I also enjoyed the way it looked at politics. I think this is the book in the Pulitzer series so far where I have most enjoyed the political content, where usually that's like the thing I like less than the kind of social content. But actually, the politics plot lines in here were really, really interesting too. The characterisation, as always, is fantastic. Trollope's writing is brilliant, and I love this a lot. Considering I have read quite a lot of Anthony Trollope books so far this year, this is my first 5-star Anthony Trollope book this year, and it did remind me of all of the reasons why I adore Trollope. So yeah, this is a fantastic book. This month's Anthony Trollope book was The Duke's Children. This is the 6th book in the Pulitzer series, the final book in the series, and I really, really loved it. This has been one of my favourite books in the series. I will be doing a whole like Pulitzer week series of reviews in Victober, talking about each book in the series, but this has been one of my favourites. Probably like my joint second favourite with Can You Forgive Her after The Prime Minister. And The Duke's Children tells the story of two people mainly, and also their father and their kind of relationship with their father, as well as their their romantic relationships. Lady Mary wants to marry a particular man, but he is not aristocratic, which her father does not approve of. And then Lord Silverbridge is torn between two very different women and is also getting into lots of trouble with money because he likes to bet a lot of money on horses. It's a really fantastic book, really, really powerful. The way it looks at like family and familial relationships is done fantastically. The way it explores money and class at this point in time is just really, really brilliant. I love Anthony Trollope a lot, and this is a great one. One was The American Senator by Anthony Trollope. I think this is just over 500 pages, 550. This is a fantastic Trollope book. I really, really enjoyed it. I love Anthony Trollope. He's one of my favourite writers this year. I have been reading a book a month by Anthony Trollope, which has been really good fun. And this has been one of my favourites that I've read this year. This follows various characters all set around one kind of smallish town. We follow kind of two heroines, a young woman called Mary, who is very likeable, and a young woman called Arabella, who is not so immediately likeable, but you do kind of understand. And we follow their sort of romantic relationships. Mary is in love with someone who she doesn't think she has any hope with and who she is not trying to marry. And Arabella is trying to marry someone who she is not in love with because she wants to get married and have a position in the world. We also have the American Senator of the title, who is not the major character. I do not really know why this book is called The American Senator. In fact, Anthony Trollope makes a joke at the very end of the book saying that it would have been better off called something else, which made me laugh. But the American Senator is visiting the man that Arabella is trying to marry, and he kind of makes many observations on the world as he sees it around him, and is kind of quite confused by English society in many ways, which is something in this book that I really enjoyed. So yeah, I really enjoyed this a lot. I think it's a really fantastic Trollope. Some really interesting plots, and kind of does what Trollope does well in terms of its social criticism and its examination of the position of women in Victorian society especially, and the way it looks at class and so on. Just, yeah, really fantastic book. Would highly recommend. My Anthony Trollope read for the month of November was The Belton Estate. So I have been doing a project this year where I try to read a novel by Anthony Trollope every month. But this was a Anthony Trollope that I really enjoyed. It wasn't one I knew that much about, but I got it out of my library and just really loved it. It tells the story of a young woman called Clara. Her father is elderly and very ill, and after his death, she will be left without any money and without anywhere to live, because the estate that her father owns and that she lives in is entailed upon a very distant relation who is a cousin of hers. And this book follows kind of Clara's dilemmas about this problem and what happens with the estate where she lives, and also her relationship with two very different men. What I really loved about this book is that Clara, the main character, is like such a compelling, engaging character. So like clever and sharp and perfectly willing to stand up for what she believes is right, and some of her speeches are just amazing. I really, really loved her as a character, and that really made me love this Anthony Trollope book a lot. I would really definitely recommend this one. I think it would be quite a good place to start with Anthony Trollope, as well as it's not too long and it's quite like accessible in its plot line. There aren't as many characters as there are in some other Anthony Trollope books, so this was a really great read and I'm very glad I read it. The first Trollope book I read in December was The Claverings, and I'm very glad that I decided to read The Claverings on a whim, because it was fantastic. It was one of my Trollope highlights of the year. So The Claverings tells the story of a family called the Claverings, specifically focusing on a young man called Harry Clavering, who in true Trollope style falls in love with one woman who is probably quite suitable for him, but then there is another woman who he used to be in love with, who he still sort of harbours feelings for, and who might not be the right choice, but also is a really sympathetic character in her own right, and therefore you're kind of rooting for two different women who both want Harry Clavering. It's very, very compelling, really good fun, really entertaining. It's really well written. Harry Clavering is a fantastic character. He has that particular characteristic that Trollope is very, very good at writing, where he has a character who does things that they really shouldn't do and behaves in a stupid way, but you also can really sympathise with because you understand that they know they're behaving stupidly. One of my favourite lines in the whole book, which I think really sums up the personality of Harry Clavering as a character, is he told himself that he was an ass,
but he still went on being an ass. But as well as this like main plot going on, there is a few sort of subplots to do with various characters, including one to do with Harry's sister. And actually the subplot to do with Harry's sister, it was wonderful, and there were like some passages in that were sort of incredibly moving. That was fantastic as well. I would super recommend the Claverings, definitely one of my Trollope highlights for the year. And I would say as well that it's probably a very good place to start with Anthony Trollope because it's not too long. The plot is not as complicated in other books. One thing I would say about the Claverings is I wouldn't read it too close to the Eustace Diamonds because the plot is slightly similar in some ways. I preferred the Claverings to the Eustace Diamonds. I enjoyed it much more, but the particular setup and the main hero, there are some similarities. They do have quite similar plots. Anthony Trollope wrote 47 novels. He had to reuse plots sometimes. I kind of forgive him. I don't really mind. Don't read them back to back. The second Anthony Trollope book I read in December was Harry Heathcote of Gangoil. So this is a short Christmas novella by Anthony Trollope. So this tells the story of a young man called Harry Heathcote. It is actually set in Australia, quite unusually for Anthony Trollope. He lives with his wife and his sister-in-law, and in his kind of obstinacy and independence and suspicion, he has like annoyed all of his neighbours, and it kind of follows him maybe realising that he should be a little bit more kindly disposed towards people. So it was a really interesting setup, and I did enjoy it. It didn't feel like an Anthony Trollope novel for me. I don't know why, possibly just because it was set in Australia, but I think if I had read that book not knowing it was by Anthony Trollope, I wouldn't have thought it was by Anthony Trollope because there was something about the writing style which just wasn't quite Trollope-y. I just didn't feel the characterisation was like as strong as Trollope's usually is, so I enjoyed it. I think it's a good story, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend this as a great Trollope to read unless you are a completionist and want to read all of Trollope like me, because there are better Trollopes out there. Another novel I read this month was Lady Anna by Anthony Trollope, which I really enjoyed. I love Anthony Trollope. I haven't read anything by Anthony Trollope since like December, and it was just so nice to read another book by him because he's so great. This was really good, actually. This was a really great Anthony Trollope. Definitely a good one. I don't know if it's one of my favourites because I've read so many of his books. I need to like sit down and think about where they all sit. But it was definitely a 5-star Anthony Trollope read, a really good one. And I would say a really good place to start with Anthony Trollope as well, because it's a bit more straightforward than some of his other novels. There's only kind of one main plot line rather than millions. So this follows a woman called Lady Anna. She is the daughter of an earl, but there is some debate about whether she is the legitimate or the illegitimate daughter of this earl, because this earl, after he'd been married to Lady Anna's mother for 6 months, said, "Oh, by the way, I was married before, she's still alive." However, there is some doubt about whether his previous wife was still alive or not. So basically Anna has grown up all her life with her mother, not really sure like what their position in society is. And then after her father dies, this kind of all comes to the fore in terms of where does his money go? Is she his legitimate daughter or not? If Anna is the legitimate daughter, then she will get all the money that was her father's. If she is the illegitimate daughter, then all of the money will go to her cousin. And then the lawyers who are caught up in this case suggest that maybe Lady Anna should marry her cousin, and then her cousin would be the earl, they'd have all the money together, everything would be fine, very straightforward, except that Anna has, in the last year, formed a secret engagement with a tailor, and she is now potentially going to be, Lady Anna, an heiress with, hundreds of thousands of pounds, and she wants to marry a working class man, and all the lawyers and her mother disapprove massively. It's a very interesting look at like the complexities of class within the Victorian period. Anna's mother is like completely determined that she will not marry this tailor, that it would be like a massive disgrace to the family and to her if Anna marries a tailor who works for his living. She thinks that it would be better for Anna to die than to marry this man. And yeah, it's just really fascinating, and all the like legal stuff in it around like inheritance law is really fascinating. Victorian inheritance law is very interesting, and Anthony Trollope writes about it in a really good way. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. Definitely recommend this. It's a really great, compelling, interesting love story with lots of twists and turns and like legal interest in it. So I definitely recommend this. So this was a great read. Very glad that I got to it. One Victorian book I read in February was The Kellys and the O'Kellys by Anthony Trollope, and this was a buddy read I did with Jenny from Bookish Shenanigans. I actually started this in January and was about halfway through it at the end of January, so I did talk about this a little bit in my January wrap-up as well. This was not my favourite Anthony Trollope book. Anthony Trollope is one of my favourite authors. I've read a lot by him. He must be one of my most read authors. I think I've read something like 24 or 25 of his books by now, but he has 47 in total, and this is definitely one of my least favourites. It was not that good. It's one of his quite early novels, and I feel like it is just less accomplished. There were some really good characters, there were some really good moments, but overall it just didn't quite work for me. So the Kellys and the O'Kellys is set in Ireland, and it follows two families, the Kellys and the O'Kellys, specifically following two men, Martin Kelly, who is a member of the Kelly family, and Lord Ballantyne, who is a member of the O'Kelly family. And both of them are engaged to marry particular different women, but those engagements are sort of in jeopardy because of family reasons and kind of family disapproval on their fiancé's part. So that's the kind of main thrust of the plot, is both of these two characters and their relationships with these women who they want to marry. There were some things about the book that I did really enjoy. Some of the characterization is really good. The ending and the kind of last third to a quarter of the book was quite strong, and I liked some of the characters. I think I like Lord Ballantyne and his plotline, and the woman he's engaged to are quite interesting, but the Kelly family I found much less interesting. And also I just feel like the pacing was completely off, and I feel like basically the Kellys and the O'Kellys is one of those books that kind of starts halfway through the plot but is still the length that it would have been if it had started at the beginning of the plot. I feel like it would have been very interesting to see these couples kind of get together at the beginning, which we don't. We start kind of halfway through the story, but then the second half of that story that we're starting halfway through of is very extended and drawn out. So it just wasn't the best of Anthony Trollope. But I do want to read everything he's written at some point, so I'm slowly working my way through. So I read two Victorian books in August. One of them was An Old Man's Love by Anthony Trollope, which I listened to on audiobook. I'm currently trying to work my way through all of Anthony Trollope's novels, and this is one of his last novels. In fact, I think this one was published posthumously after Anthony Trollope had died. And this is my 26th Anthony Trollope novel out of his 47, so I'm making progress through his work. I really enjoyed reading An Old Man's Love. It is one of Anthony Trollope's kind of shorter, more focused books, and reminds me in that way of sort of the Warden and Dr. Wortle's school in terms of the sort of tighter plotting. It's really about one theme and kind of exploring that idea. So the majority of the novel An Old Man's Love takes place only over kind of a week or two, and it follows a man called Mr. Whittlestaff. He's 50 years old, and after the death of one of his close friends, he has taken in that friend's daughter, who's a woman in her mid-20s, who has been living with Mr. Whittlestaff kind of as his ward for the last 2 years. And as she has been living in his house, Mr. Whittlestaff has found himself falling in love with her. And this book is about his love for this young woman, Mary, the kind of age difference between them and the way that affects his feelings for her, and also her feelings for him in return, and how she kind of finds herself divided between Mr. Whittlestaff and a man called John Gordon, who she knew 3 years before and was in love with then, but hasn't seen for a very long time. And the novel is about the dynamic between these people, and as I said, it's kind of set over quite a short space of time and is very kind of focused in on its theme. It was a really enjoyable novel. I feel like it's one of those ones where the more I think about it, the more I'm going to really like it. Anthony Trollope has some novels which follow a lot of different characters and weave a lot of different plots together, which I love, but I also really like his more focused novels, because I think he's very good at characterization and kind of internal psychology, and this book is a book that looks a lot at kind of internal psychology and is really a sort of character study of various individuals in a way that I thoroughly enjoyed. It's very funny in places, but also kind of poignant and moving, and I thought it was just done really, really well. I love Anthony Trollope's writing style a lot, and I feel like this was a really great read. I need to work out where I would place it in my Anthony Trollope ranking, but I'm gonna do an Anthony Trollope ranking video in Victober, so I guess you can find out then, and I'll try and work out how much I love it in comparison to other Anthony Trollope books, because I really loved it, but there are many Anthony Trollope books I love a lot. Another thing I was thinking, there is a Dickens novel, I'm not going to say which one in case it is vaguely spoilery, because I don't think it's a plot point until halfway through, but there is a Dickens novel in which a older man, who I think is probably about 50, falls in love with a woman in their 20s, and that's not the major point of the book, that's just an element of the book, and I feel like Anthony Trollope was reading that Dickens book and thought, I would like to explore this theme more, and then wrote An Old Man's Love. I don't know why I have it in my head, but there's just something about the kind of setup and the characters that reminded me of that element of that Dickens book. That sounds very vague, but if you've read that Dickens book and you know what I'm talking about, then I think you'll find An Old Man's Love a really interesting novel. I really like Anthony Trollope. He's just a very trustworthy pair of hands when it comes to plotting. So yeah, a really great read. My highlight of the month, my favourite book of the month, and a bit of a new favourite for me, is The Vicar of Bullhampton by Anthony Trollope. I love Anthony Trollope. He's been one of my favourite Victorian authors for a really long time, but this is definitely one that would make it into my top few Anthony Trollope books, and he did write a lot. I think I've now read 28 books by him. I really liked The Vicar of Bullhampton. This follows various plot lines, all of which sort of centre on a man who is the Vicar of Bullhampton. So we're following a murder that happens in the neighbourhood, how that affects the Vicar of Bullhampton, especially when a kind of person who used to be his protege comes under suspicion. We're also following a kind of argument between the Vicar of Bullhampton and a local lord about where a nonconformist church can and can't be built. And then we're also following the love triangle of a young woman who is the best friend of the vicar's wife, and who is staying with them, and she kind of has two potential suitors. I really loved The Vicar of Bullhampton for lots of reasons. It was great in so many ways. I really liked all of the plot lines, and I liked that the first two plot lines were quite unusual plot lines for Victorian books. I always like it when Anthony Trollope looks at local politics and church politics. I thought the kind of murder trial going on in the book was really interesting, and it's not done in a very sensational way, as you tend to get murders in Victorian books. It is much more of a kind of examination of the social effects on the people who are affected by the suspicions thrown up by this case. And then I really liked the love triangle plot. It was so good, and it was really interesting, and it looked really complicatedly at emotion and duty and kind of what Victorian society expected of women, and this idea that so much of Victorian society had that if an eligible, amiable man likes you, you should just marry him because that's what you should do. That kind of just idea within Victorian society is really interrogated and torn apart in a great way. So I really enjoyed that, and yeah, it was just great. I really like Anthony Trollope very much, and The Vicar of Bullhampton was wonderful, and yeah, definitely my highlight of the month. Then the other Victorian book I read in April was Orley Farm by Anthony Trollope, which I was buddy reading with Emily from Novelle Novels. I'll link her channel down below. I really enjoyed Orley Farm. This was a great Anthony Trollope book. I am slowly working my way through all of Anthony Trollope's novels. He wrote 47, and I think this is my 28th, my 29th. Getting nearer to having read 30 books by Anthony Trollope. He did write a lot, and I do love his books hugely. So Orley Farm is all about various characters who are connected by a kind of lawsuit or a legal dispute, I suppose. We know that just over 20 years before the story starts, a man died, and this man had a family, some children from his first wife, and then he also had a baby son from his second wife. And the eldest son from his first marriage thought that all the property was going to go to him, but after the man's death, a codicil appeared, a will that said that all the property was to go to the baby son, but there was some dispute about whether or not it was legal. However, it was eventually decided that all the property, Orley Farm, should go to the youngest son, and then we pick up with all of these characters 20 odd years later, when Lucius Mason, the young son, is in his early 20s, his mother, Lady Mason, is in her 40s, and suddenly the question about who should really own Orley Farm comes into question again. But we're also following a lot of other characters, and there's a lot of love stories, subplots, and other things going on. I just really enjoyed Orley Farm. There are so many fantastic characters in it. Anthony Trollope is really wonderful at complicated characters and complicated character relationships. There's some fantastic love stories, but there's also some really nice different family relationships being explored. I feel like the relationship between Lucius Mason and his mother, Lady Mason, was really good. Lady Mason is in general a fantastic character. And there's also these side characters, this family called the Ormes, who I found really interesting. And they're a family of 3 generations, but one person in each generation. So there is the grandfather, and then there is his daughter-in-law, because his son died very young, and his grandson. And the relationship between him and his daughter-in-law I thought was done really well. And
and the relationship between them, and the way Mrs. Orme kind of treats her father-in-law, and their friendship and their familial bond, I thought was done so well. And there's also these side characters called the Furnivalls, this married couple in their 50s whose marriage is sort of falling apart, and their daughter who is quite interesting and kind of calculating, and I really liked them as a family too. I thought they were really interesting, and there was just a lot of wonderful characters and a lot of wonderful subplots, as well as the central plot being really, really interesting. I like it when Anthony Trollope kind of looks at law and inheritance, and that's one of those themes which is really kind of interesting within Victorian society and interesting within Anthony Trollope's book. So Orley Farm was definitely a really, really strong Anthony Trollope for me. One of my favourites, but I also have so many favourites because I've read so many of his books. But yeah, it was great. Would highly, highly recommend Orley Farm. But my favourite thing of the month was The Three Clerks by Anthony Trollope, which was just absolutely fantastic. I love Anthony Trollope very, very much. He is one of my all-time favourite authors, and this book was just wonderful. One of my favourite Anthony Trollopes, just fantastic. I loved it so much. So this tells the story of three clerks working in the civil service. Harry is sort of like the well-behaved one, and Charlie is very much not the well-behaved one, and Alaric is somewhere in the middle where he sort of acts as though he's well-behaved, but actually maybe there's some more complicated, darker, messy stuff going on under the surface. And the book is about these three clerks, their friendships, their work, and also their connection with a family who live just outside of London, who are Harry Norman's cousins, but Alaric and Charlie end up kind of getting to know them too. And this family consists of a widow and three daughters. And if you know anything about Victorian novels and the marriage plot, you can imagine that the three daughters and the three clerks are going to have some interweaving romantic plots. And it was just excellent. It was just an utter joy in so many ways. So there are many reasons why I love this book. One, just because it's Anthony Trollope and I love the way he writes and his characterization and his plotting. Like, I just absolutely love his novels. I just feel like I can always trust Anthony Trollope to give me like the ending I want, which is something that is very nice because I feel like that's not the case in all Victorian novels. Then another thing that I really loved about this book is that it's about the Victorian civil service, and I actually find the Victorian civil service fascinating, and I always have. Anthony Trollope did himself work in the civil service within like the post office, so he was very familiar with the workings of the civil service, and I feel like you can really tell this. Anyway, Charlie was probably my favourite character. He also wants to be a writer, and I feel like the bits about him kind of trying to get published and trying to make a career for himself as an author, and his kind of hopes that that will help him become a better person, I feel like that was all really interesting too. And just in general, like, I feel like Anthony Trollope is so wonderful at creating characters who behave badly, have lots of flaws, do all the wrong things, but also you don't hate them, you just feel like they're letting themselves down and not living up to their true potential. And I feel like there are many characters in The Three Clerks that fit into that, and I feel like Anthony Trollope does it wonderfully. So I really thoroughly enjoyed this, just thought it was great, and yeah, what a joy. Love this very, very much. Then I read two books in December by Anthony Trollope, one of which was Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite. This was another book that I listened to on audiobook. I actually read a lot on audiobook in December, more on audiobook than I read physically, actually. I listened to Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite by Anthony Trollope, which is an Anthony Trollope book I feel kind of divided on, because I really, really, really loved it until like the last couple of pages, and then the very ending like disappointed me in a way that Anthony Trollope doesn't often do. Like, usually I find Anthony Trollope like really reliable in his plotting, but there was just something he did at the very end. In fact, it was actually like effectively the same thing as George Meredith did at the end of The Ordeal of Richard Featherall, which really bothered me and which I didn't think really worked. So I feel like Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite was like a 5-star favourite book of the year read until like the last few pages, and then it was not. So I don't know. Sir Harry Hotspur is basically about a man called Sir Harry Hotspur who is a baronet, and for most of his life he's had 2 children, a daughter and a son. His estate and his title, etc., will go to his son, and then his son passes away when he's kind of in his early 20s, I think, and then he's left only with one child, a daughter, and Sir Harry Hotspur is kind of divided between whether he should leave his money and his land to his daughter or to his nearest male heir, who is a cousin who is a rather dissipated young man. And the book is basically about Sir Harry Hotspur and his wife, their daughter, and this cousin of the family. I think there are 2 kind of characters that Anthony Trollope does really well, which you see kind of highlighted to Anthony Trollope's full skill in Sir Harry Hotspur, one of which is the kind of like dissipated young man, because I think Anthony Trollope has some fantastic characters in his books who are young men who have behaved badly, and sometimes they're young men who've behaved badly but can be saved and can be made into better men if only they're kind of like try harder, and sometimes they're young men who cannot be made into better men, and who are just scoundrels through and through, and often you don't know for quite a long time which kind of young man that bad young man is going to turn out to be, and I feel like that is done very well in Sir Harry Hotspur, and then I also feel like Sir Harry Hotspur as a character himself kind of fits into a type of character you get in a few Anthony Trollope novels of this kind of like old English gentleman who cares a lot about their family and their kind of rank and their prestige and reputation, but also cares a lot about their family, and loves the people around them, and the kind of conflict between sort of family pride and loving the individual members of your family. I feel like that is done really, really well in Sir Harry Hotspur as a character and as a book, and is something that we also see in other Anthony Trollope books, you know, like The Small House at Allington. I feel like the exploration of like pride as a theme and a character trait in Sir Harry Hotspur was done really, really well. So I really, really, really loved it in so many ways, and then just like the very ending, just Anthony Trollope did something I didn't want him to do, and it made me sad because usually he's very reliable. This has only happened twice in an Anthony Trollope book. This book, Sir Harry Hotspur of Humblethwaite, and Phineas Redux are two books by Anthony Trollope where he just like did something in the plot and I was like, no, Anthony Trollope, why would you do that? That wasn't what I wanted you to do, and I just, yeah, I don't know. It was good, but I just, yeah, was slightly disappointed. Then the other Anthony Trollope book I read this month, which I didn't listen to an audiobook, I just read this on my Kindle, and that was Kept in the Dark. And this is a shorter novel of his, which is about a young woman who basically, at the beginning of the book, gets engaged to a man that she doesn't really know very well. And as she soon realises that actually he's not that great a man, he's not a very nice person, and she doesn't want to get married to him, so she breaks off her engagement. A year later, she meets another man, falls in love with him, and they get engaged. And before they get engaged, he says that he has previously been jilted by someone. You know, he was engaged to someone, she broke off their engagement, and he was kind of very unhappy about that. He tells her this story, and then afterwards they get engaged. But she doesn't tell him that she has been engaged previously because she feels a bit weird about it, because, you know, he was jilted by someone before and she jilted someone, so she just decides she's not going to tell him. But the longer she doesn't tell him for, the bigger a deal it becomes. And of course at some point he's going to find out, and the longer she keeps it a secret, the more he's going to think she has more to hide than she actually does. And so everything kind of goes on from there. There were some things that I really liked about Kept in the Dark. I love Anthony Trollope always, like his writing and his characterisation is always great, so I really enjoyed it from that perspective. And I feel like the way this book looked at marriage and kind of secrets and gender and jealousy, all of that stuff was done really well. But I did keep thinking all the way through that it had a lot of themes in common with He Knew He Was Right, which is another of Anthony Trollope's books, and is a much bigger, longer book by Anthony Trollope. And I just feel like He Knew He Was Right does all those themes better. So while I liked Kept in the Dark, and I feel like as a Trollope completionist who's trying to read all of his books, I'm glad I read it, I feel like I would recommend that you read He Knew He Was Right instead of Kept in the Dark, if you want an exploration of those kind of themes. So I liked Kept in the Dark, but yeah, not one of my favourite Anthony Trollope books. The first one that I read was Nina Balatka by Anthony Trollope, which I really enjoyed. This is a novel from 1867, and it's a slightly different one for Anthony Trollope. Apparently he initially published it anonymously, which is interesting. I've read a lot of Anthony Trollope books before. He's one of my favourite authors. I must have read 29 or 30 books by him now. He wrote 47 though, so I still have a way to go. And it was really enjoyable to read Nina Balatka. I thought it was a really great book. So as I said, it is a slightly different one for Anthony Trollope. It's not set in the UK, it is set in Prague. And it follows a young woman called Nina Balatka. She is sort of middle class, but her father has fallen on hard times. They have very, very little money. They have some wealthy relations, but her and her father have really next to nothing. Nina is Christian, and she has fallen in love with a Jewish man,
businesswoman who has done some business with her father. And the book basically follows the engagement of Nina and Anton and how all of their kind of friends and family disapprove of their marriage because she's Christian and he's Jewish, and especially Nina's sort of wealthier relations really disapprove of her engagement to Anton, and the book basically follows them as a couple, and Nina kind of dealing with the difficulties of her engagement, while meanwhile her and her father are sort of becoming increasingly destitute. I thought Nina Balatka was a really fantastic book, and I really enjoyed it. I went into this book not really knowing anything about it, as I do with all the Trollope books that I read now, because I've really gone into his obscure works these days. And when I realised what the premise was, I was a little bit wary, because the presentation of Jewish characters in Victorian literature is often not great and quite anti-Semitic. But actually in this book, Anthony Trollope is writing about and against anti-Semitism, and there's a lot of exploration of prejudice and intolerance in a way that I thought was done really well. And in general, I just thought this was a fantastic book. It's one of Anthony Trollope's like shorter, more focused books, where he sort of takes a theme or a plot point and sort of runs with it, and that is what all of the book is about. But I feel like the characterization was done really well. Nina and Anton both really came to life and felt like really complex, fully rounded individuals, as did most of the characters around them. And I feel like the look at 19th century Prague and the divisions between Christian and Jewish communities there at the time was really interesting. As I think I've mentioned before, Anthony Trollope, having written 47 books, sometimes does sort of repeat plots. And one thing I found quite interesting about Nina Balatka is that it reminded me quite a lot of Lady Anna. Lady Anna is a book by Anthony Trollope, which I really like as well. And Lady Anna is a book about an earl's daughter who has fallen in love with a tailor. And I feel like the way he wrote about like religious and cultural prejudice in Nina Balatka was quite similar to the way he wrote about sort of class prejudice in Lady Anna, which I found kind of interesting. I'm pretty sure Lady Anna came later. But yeah, anyway, I really enjoyed Nina Balatka, one I would recommend. And yeah, I really like Anthony Trollope, and I'm glad that I am continuing to work my way slowly through all of his many books. This month I also read An Eye for an Eye by him, which was published in 1879, though apparently he wrote it in 1870. And this was a fantastic book. This book has a fairly conventional Anthony Trollope setup at the beginning. We have an elderly earl, and after the death of his only son, he invites his nephew, his new heir, to come and live with him. This young man is in the army, and he says he will come and live with his uncle, but he wants to finish off one last year in the army because he enjoys it. When the young man is visiting his uncle, the Earl, he is introduced to a woman who his uncle and aunt would like him to marry. But while away in Ireland with his regiment, he has met a young Irish Roman Catholic girl whose family are possibly not that respectable, and who he knows his Protestant upper class English family would not approve of. And this book is basically about what happens. And you think you know where it's going, but you also kind of don't. This book is a really fantastic Anthony Trollope, and a very surprising one. This book has, as I said, a kind of conventional Trollope setup, but we also have this title, An Eye for an Eye, which tells you things are going to possibly get a bit dark. And we know from a kind of prologue to the book that one of these characters is going to end up in an asylum, and we don't know why. And it just is fantastic. Like, the ending is just really good. And there were some wonderful moments in here and some fantastic characterization. And I feel like one of the things I love so much about this book, and which I love so much about Anthony Trollope as a whole, is that his psychology is always really interesting. Like, there are so many characters who exist in kind of grey areas between good and bad, and Trollope just examines that so well. And also the way your feelings about particular characters change across the course of this not very long novel is just like really well done. I just thought this was so good. Like, I just thought this was such a fantastic Anthony Trollope book, and I highly recommend it. It's a really good one, pretty short too, and yeah, very compelling, very interesting. I would definitely recommend it. Then another Victorian book I read in December was Ralph the Heir by Anthony Trollope from 1871, which, if you have seen my favourite classics of 2023 video, I did declare my favourite classic of the year, and it was fantastic. I loved Ralph the Heir so much. It tells a story of various characters. There is a lawyer and his two daughters. They're about to adopt a kind of cousin of theirs who's coming from abroad, and there are also several people called Mr. Newton, like 4 people called Mr. Newton, 2 of which are called Ralph Newton, just for extra
confusion. There is Ralph the heir, who is due to inherit a property from his uncle, Mr. Newton / Squire Newton, and then there is also Ralph the illegitimate, the son of the present Squire of Newton, who, because he's illegitimate, is not due to inherit, but he is in many ways a better man than Ralph the heir, and we follow the kind of relationships between the two Ralphs and other characters and the three young ladies who I've already mentioned, and it's just great. I just really love so many things in Anthony Trollope, but I think some of the things I love best about him are his kind of complicated inheritance plots, his flawed young men, where you're not really sure if they're going to be redeemably flawed or irredeemably flawed, and his like grumpy old squires. And I just feel like Anthony Trollope combines all of those things at their best in Ralph the heir. I also loved the characters of Ralph the illegitimate and his father, the Squire of Newton. They were two of my favourite Anthony Trollope characters I've encountered for ages, and I just thought Ralph the heir was fantastic. So I highly, highly recommend it. What a great book. I also read an Anthony Trollope book this month. I read this, which is The Struggles of Brown, Jones and Robinson. This is a novel from 1862, and it's a very different Anthony Trollope book. It's definitely one of his more like shorter, focused novels, and it looks at quite a different like social group to the groups you usually find in Anthony Trollope books. In general, Anthony Trollope books skew a bit more like aristocratic, or at least like upper middle class, whereas this book is about a group of, I guess, upper working class characters. So in this book, a man called Mr. Brown inherits some money after his wife's death, and he decides that he wants to use his money to go into business, to set up a firm of some description. So he ends up going into partnership with his son-in-law, Mr. Jones, and his want-to-be son-in-law, Mr. Robinson, who is really in love with his other daughter, but they can't quite see eye to eye. And so these three men go into partnership together to start a haberdashery shop. Mr. Brown is kind of in charge of the finances, Mr. Jones is kind of in charge of stuff on the shop floor, and Mr. Robinson is in charge of the advertising. And George Robinson really is a fan of false advertising, and quite a lot of this book is about his advertising exploits and his increasingly wild advertisements and his increasingly mad attempts to bring more people to the shop. And this book kind of is chiefly about this enterprise, and then partly also about George Robinson trying to woo Mr. Brown's daughter, who isn't really sure whether she wants to marry him or marry the butcher who lives down the road, whose income is a bit more secure. However, one interesting element of this book is that we also have this like preface at the beginning where George Robinson writes in first person that this is his account of what happened between them. And then the book carries on in third person, as Anthony Trollope's books usually are. But we always know throughout the third person perspective that it is George Robinson writing this. Like, we know that this is George Robinson's view of what happened, which is actually really, really fun, because we know from the beginning that George Robinson doesn't like Mr. Jones. And so you always know that everything about Mr. Jones is a bit biased, and that like George Robinson's descriptions of himself as, you know, an advertising genius are very biased, and that his view on the women, especially on the young woman that he's in love with, is definitely biased. And so even though this is a book written in third person, you get like the bias of a first person unreliable narrator, which is quite fun. And I just really enjoyed this book. It was quite a different Anthony Trollope book, like I said, looking at a different social group and a different theme, I guess. You know, there's a lot in here about shopkeeping and advertising, which is not something you read about very much in Victorian literature. And the way this book looked at, like Victorian marketing, basically, it was just really interesting. So I really enjoyed this. It was really good fun. I wouldn't say it's a great Anthony Trollope book to start with, maybe, because it is a bit niche, but I also really liked it, so definitely one I'd recommend.
And then the other book that I read for Kate's challenge was Linda Tressel by Anthony Trollope, which is a really powerful short novel from 1868 about a young woman called Linda Tressel living with her aunt in Germany. Linda Tressel's aunt is very, very religious and has brought Linda up very, very strictly, and she has decided that it is Linda's duty to marry their lodger, a man who is 30 years Linda's senior. Linda desperately does not want to marry Peter. She's in love with someone else, and even if she wasn't, she really does not want to marry this man. And what follows is basically 200 pages of Peter and Linda's aunt trying to force Linda to marry this man. And it is horrible. Like, it is such a good book. I think it is fantastic, but it is really oppressive and unpleasant to read because it is so intense and uncomfortable. The pressure and oppression that Linda is constantly living under, and the way these two older people kind of gang up on her to try and force her to do something she really doesn't want to do. It is so intense and horrible, but it is such a well-drawn novel. I feel like Anthony Trollope is often a real comfort author for me. Like, I often go to his books for like pure joy, but Linda Tressel was not a comfort read. It was very, very good, but it was not comforting. It was very intense and grim. But I really thought it was fantastic. So I would really recommend Linda Tressel. Unpleasant to read, but so well written and really well drawn. I'll start off talking about Mr. Scarborough's Family, which is a novel from 1883. I love Anthony Trollope, and I basically always love his books, and Mr. Scarborough's Family was no exception. It was really great. It is a complicated kind of inheritance plot novel with a bit of a love triangle going on as well. The novel begins with a very wealthy man named Mr. Scarborough declaring that his eldest son was in fact born before his marriage and is therefore illegitimate, and therefore his massive fortune is not going to be inherited by his eldest son, who is very heavily in debt, but is going to go to his younger son. And the rest of the book kind of follows the fallout from this declaration. We follow the eldest son, who has now been declared illegitimate. We follow the younger son, who has now become the heir to the property. We follow old Mr. Scarborough, all three of whom are very complicated characters. We also follow Mrs. Scarborough's niece, Florence, who is the heroine of the novel and who I really, really liked. Florence was a real highlight of the book. She was a wonderful character. And we also follow the man who she is in love with, Harry, who is caught up in the sort of Scarborough family dramas in complicated ways that I won't go into. I'll let you discover that for yourself. We also follow various other characters, including Mr. Scarborough's lawyer, Gray, and his daughter. I really, really enjoyed their dynamic and relationship. He goes home from work every day and like tells his daughter about all of his legal troubles, and she offers her wise advice. Overall, I really liked Mr. Scarborough's Family. There were a lot of wonderful elements. Florence was a wonderful character, and I feel like the inheritance plotline was done really, really well. I think if I had read this in a different month, I would have loved it even more. But it did pale a little bit in comparison with the next book I'm going to talk about, which was amazing. But I did still think overall that it was a really strong Anthony Trollope novel. And I think especially if you enjoy his kind of inheritance plot lines, his inheritance disputes, then you will really like Mr. Scarborough's Family. It is worth being aware that there is some anti-Semitism within Mr. Scarborough's Family. Captain Scarborough owes a lot of money to several Jewish moneylenders, and the way these characters are drawn definitely has some unpleasant stereotyping within it. Anthony Trollope is quite a varied author for this kind of thing. His novel, Nina Balatka, is really, really critical of anti-Semitism, but you do still see quite a lot of like stereotypes present within other books by him. Anyway, moving on to the other Anthony Trollope book that I read in October, and that was Ayala's Angel. I actually started Ayala's Angel back in September, but I did read a massive chunk of it in October, and oh, I loved it so much. Ayala's Angel is like a new top 5 Anthony Trollope. So good. So good. This book tells the story of two sisters, Ayala and Lucy, and after their father's death, they are split up. One sent to live with one relation, one sent to live with another, and we follow their lives and their love stories and their family difficulties from that point onwards. Lucy is in love with a young man who her family disapprove of, and Ayala has a lot of suitors that her family all approve of, and she doesn't want to marry any of them. And one of the reasons why Ayala doesn't want to marry any of them is because she has this idea in her mind of this angel of light, the sort of perfect man that she would want to marry, and no one quite lives up to that idea in her head. And it's just excellent. Like, I can't explain how much I love Ayala's Angel. It was so good. When I talked about Anthony Trollope being a comfort read, like, Ayala's Angel was such a comfort and so good. It brought me so much joy and delight. Like, every moment was amazing. Jonathan Stubbs, like, a new favourite Anthony Trollope character. Loved him so much. The characterisation was amazing. Portraits of unrequited love were fantastic. I feel like it was probably a bit repetitive and a bit longer than it needed to be, but I just didn't care because I loved every second. It was so good. Highly, highly recommend it. Favourite classic of the year that wasn't a reread. Favourite Victorian book I've read since probably the Beth book last October. New, like, top 5 Anthony Trollope. What an amazing book. Cannot recommend it enough. Then the Anthony Trollope book I read in January was one of his final books, published in 1882. This is The Fixed Period. And this was a weird novel, like a really unusual Anthony Trollope book. probably one to read for an Anthony Trollope completionist rather than like one you must read. But if the premise sounds interesting to you, maybe give it a go, because it's very odd and very unlike most of Trollope's books. So the Fixed Period is set in the future. It was written in 1882, but it's set in the 1960s, 1970s, I think, in a fictional former British colony that has recently gained independence. And one of their new laws and one of their sort of leading differences from Britain is that they have introduced the law of the Fixed Period, which says that the correct amount of time to live is 68 years. So on your 67th birthday, you are transferred to a college where you live out the final year of your life, and on your 68th birthday, you are euthanized and cremated. And the fact that they're cremated is actually weirdly important, because cremation was still very taboo kind of in the 1880s in Britain. So the idea not only that these people would be killed before their time, but the idea that they would be cremated sort of creates a lot of horror for all the characters in the book. And basically we're following the president of the society, Mr. Neverbend, who is very stubborn, as you might guess from his name, and he is in favour of the Fixed Period rule, but the country is quite young. Most of the inhabitants of this small island, which is I think somewhere near New Zealand, are quite young, so it's a few years before the first person turns 67, and when the first person turns 67, suddenly everyone realises what this rule might mean, and there's a lot of resistance to it, and we follow Mr. Neverbend and what happens from then on. What I don't know about the Fixed Period, what I cannot work out about it, is what Anthony Trollope thought. This book was published when Anthony Trollope was 67 years old, and he actually died before his 68th birthday. He passed away of a stroke, and his health was failing kind of in the years before this. And what I don't know was whether Anthony Trollope wrote this sort of satirical book about the fact that young people don't have enough respect for their elders, or whether he wrote it because he got to age 67 and was like, I've kind of had enough. Or maybe the whole Fixed Period thing is not the point at all. In a way, is it all about the fact that Mr. Neverbend, the president, is too stubborn, and that is his kind of tragedy? Does it actually not matter what the law is? I just don't know what Anthony Trollope was trying to say. Yeah, I don't know really what to make of the Fixed Period. It was fascinating, but it's a very atypical Anthony Trollope novel, so I don't think it'll be a good place to start with him or anything like that. So yes, I'm making progress in trying to read all of Anthony Trollope's novels by the end of the year. So we'll start off with the Anthony Trollope book I read in February, and that was La Vendée from 1850. This was one of Anthony Trollope's first novels. I think it was his third novel out of the 47 that he wrote, and it's quite different from his other books. It's a work of historical fiction. It's set in 1790s France during the counter-revolution and civil war that took place in La Vendée, and it looks at various characters who are on the royalist side following the French Revolution and how they are trying to resist the new Republican regime. This kind of begins with resistance amongst the peasantry to military conscription from the new French Republic, and then that ends up kind of turning into a bigger conflict. And we're following various characters, chiefly focusing on the kind of aristocracy in La Vendée and their role in the military operations. So there are three friends, three aristocratic / gentry gentlemen, and we're kind of following them, as well as their sisters and love interests, and several other characters too. There were a lot of things I really liked about La Vendée. I found it very historically interesting, both the look at 1790s France and also someone in Victorian Britain looking back on 1790s France. And in general, it was a really engaging read with some wonderful moments. Anthony Trollope is one of my absolute favourite authors. I always love all of his books, pretty much. I love the way he writes. I love the way he looks at character relationships. And I feel like there were some fantastic scenes, and also some really interesting characters. One character who I really didn't like as a person, but was really interestingly drawn. I thought he was great. I don't in general love a novel with lots of military stuff in it, and especially kind of the 19th century style of writing about that kind of thing tends to be a little bit pulled back. So I didn't find the kind of battlefield and battle tactics scenes that engaging necessarily. There were a couple of action sequences that weren't like on a battlefield where there were action sequences kind of taking place in slightly different settings, and I thought they were fantastic and really well done, but the actual battles themselves I wasn't quite as engaged in. But you know, along with all the kind of military and political stuff in the book, there are also lots of love stories, as of course there are. It's an Anthony Trollope book, and I thought the love stories and kind of other plot lines to do with character relationships were done really well. It's interesting that, to my knowledge, Anthony Trollope didn't write any other novels with lots of military action in. I mean, I do still have a few of his books left to read, but I don't think it's something he returned to a lot. This was his third novel, and I don't think he wrote much like this again. Maybe he didn't like it, maybe it didn't do very well. It didn't feel necessarily like Anthony Trollope writing the thing he was best at, but I did still think it was interesting and good overall. Then I also read 2 works of Victorian literature in March, both of which were rereads. So one of them was my Anthony Trollope pick for the month, which was He Knew He Was Right. I didn't actually read the physical copy, listened to the audiobook narrated by Nigel Patterson, I think, which was very, very good. So He Knew He Was Right is a really, really wonderful novel by Anthony Trollope, a real favourite of mine. I had read this before, but not since I was a teenager, and it was really nice to revisit it and remember all the things that I think are amazing about this book. So He Knew He Was Right is a story of various characters. You know, it's quite a long book, so there's lots of different subplots, and I love it when Victorian literature does that. But the kind of central plot is about a married couple, Louis and Emily Trevelyan, and what happens when the husband becomes increasingly jealous about his wife's friendship with another man, and we watch how this causes their marriage to fall apart, and a lot of the book is about the kind of breakdown of their marriage, and therefore explores like Victorian marriage, gender roles, custody battles, and all that kind of stuff in a really, really interesting way. And meanwhile, there are also lots of other subplots going on, and I love some of the subplots in He Knew He Was Right. There are some wonderful, wonderful characters, some wonderful love stories, some wonderful like family stories. Miss Stanbury is just like one of my favourite characters. I love her very, very much. And there's so much going on in He Knew He Was Right that I just absolutely love. I had such a great time reading it. Love listening to the audiobook. And there were just so many fantastic moments. I think it's such a great book. I will leave my review link down below where I spoke about it for like a good 20 minutes, which I won't do here. But yes, I love it a lot. One of my absolute favourite Anthony Trollopes. And it's a standalone as well, which not all of his are, so you can begin here or, you know, read it without having read any of his others. Although there is one passing reference to Barsetshire, not in a spoiler way at all, but that just like really made me smile, because I had forgotten that because I hadn't read the Barsetshire Chronicles when I first read this, so that was fun. The other work of Victorian literature I read in June was The Golden Lion of Granpère by Anthony Trollope, which I really, really enjoyed. Every time I read a book by Anthony Trollope, I do just kind of think to myself, why aren't I constantly reading Anthony Trollope? Because I love his books so much. And I want to be constantly reading them, but other books always get in the way. Anyway, The Golden Lion of Granpère tells the story of this family at this inn in Alsace, so in France, but near the borders of Switzerland and Germany. And we're following this innkeeper and his son from his first marriage and his second wife's niece. So these two young people, there was maybe a bit of a flirtation going on between them, and the father wasn't happy about a flirtation going on under his roof. And he spoke to his son about this. His son therefore left the inn and has gone to work elsewhere. And while he's away, the father kind of wants his niece by marriage to marry this other potential suitor. And so we have a bit of a love triangle and various other things going on. And there's a lot that I really like about The Golden Lion of Granpère. I love the way it's written. I thought the characterization was really interesting and the sort of character relationships were really interesting. One thing I always love about Anthony Trollope is sort of the complicated psychology and the realistic behaviour of his characters. Like, I always think people just behave in a very human way in Anthony Trollope, which, you know, is great. And I really like it. It was interesting reading it. It kind of put me in mind of two other shorter focus books by Anthony Trollope, Nina Balatka and Linda Tressel. These three books are all pretty short and focused, and they're all set in continental Europe rather than in Britain, and they all look at a determined young woman who is being pressured to take an action in relation to marriage by her family that she doesn't want to take. And I would say that The Golden Lion of Granpère is probably like the least dark of the three, but I feel like those three books all have quite similar themes and are quite like interesting to look at together. And Nina Balatka and Linda Tressel like have previously been published in one volume by Oxford World Classics, I think, ages ago. So they kind of are often put together, but I don't usually see the golden line of Granpère put with them. But I actually feel like they do go quite well together. So yeah, anyway, I really enjoyed that. I always love Anthony Trollope whenever I read something by him. The other Victorian book I read in August was The Bertrams by Anthony Trollope. This was my Anthony Trollope book this month, which I found really, really interesting. Again, I would say, a bit like A Pair of Blue Eyes by Thomas Hardy, not a place to start with Anthony Trollope. I would say that this book, when it's good, is really, really good. Like, there are some truly fantastic moments in here, some really interesting themes, some interesting characters, and there were some scenes that I just thought were absolutely incredible. The second half of the novel especially, I thought was very, very strong. But I don't think it is his best, and I think some of the themes he's exploring in here, especially to do with sort of pride and lack of communication between couples, I think those themes are explored better in some of his other books, thinking especially of He Knew He Was Right, which is such a masterpiece, and I feel like it explores some of the same themes as The Bertrams more effectively. So The Bertrams is about two young men, really, George Bertram and his cousin Arthur Wilkinson. Arthur is in love but doesn't feel he has the finances to support a wife, and George is also in love, but the woman he wants to marry doesn't feel that he has enough finances to support her. So complicated issues to do with love and financial stability and class, and there is a lot in this book about pride. The characterization is really strong. I feel like the way I describe this book makes it sound like a sort of straightforward marriage plot novel, but it is not. There are a lot of other complicated things going on in here. As I said, I don't think this is the best Anthony Trollope. I think this would be somewhere in the middle for me. And I do think that if you're thinking about reading this book and you haven't read He Knew He Was Right, go and read He Knew He Was Right instead. But if you like Anthony Trollope, it is really worth your time. One thing I do think it is worth knowing going into The Bertrams is that there are portions of the book where characters travel abroad. The characters go to 19th century Turkey, Palestine, Egypt, and there's quite a lot of like racial stereotyping and racist comments, which, you know, isn't hugely surprising considering when this book was written, but is quite jarring. And that's not something I remember finding in other Anthony Trollope novels particularly. So I do think that is another reason not to start with this one, but I am glad I read it. And like I said, there were some fantastic moments. Like, there were some chapters in here that were like the best, like absolute top tier Anthony Trollope, some of the best chapters Trollope's written, but the rest of the book wasn't quite as amazing. We'll start off with my Anthony Trollope book, and that was Rachel Ray. So this, as I said, is one that I've read before, but not for a really long time. I had forgotten most of it, and it was really nice to revisit it. This is a relatively short Anthony Trollope novel following a sort of love story with obstacles, I suppose. There's a young woman called Rachel Ray who lives in a cottage with her mother and sister. They are sort of in the lower middle classes, I suppose. They don't have that much money. And they're not sort of like highly respected in the town, but they are like in the middle classes. Rachel meets a young man called Luke Rowan, who has come to town because he has just inherited a important share in a local brewery. Luke and Rachel meet and like each other, but various things kind of get in the way of their relationship. And one of the things that sort of gets between them is sort of like issues of respectability and trustworthiness, because Rachel's elder sister basically doesn't think that any young woman talking to any young man could possibly be respectable and is very suspicious of Luke, and everything kind of goes on from there. And there's lots of drama around the brewery and a local election and various other things. I really enjoyed Rachel Ray. It was good fun, really interesting. Not a top tier Trollope. I feel like I remembered it very fondly because it was the third Anthony Trollope book I read, and I was like, oh yes, I love Anthony Trollope. But returning to it after I've read like 42 of his books, it wouldn't be that high in my ranking. It's good, it's fine, I enjoyed it a lot, but there are more exciting books by Anthony Trollope out there, that's what I'd say. Also worth knowing, if you do read Rachel Ray, in the sort of like final quarter of the book, there's quite a lot of like anti-Semitism. The local election is contested between like the local squire and a Jewish tailor, and a lot of the characters are very anti-Semitic towards the tailor. It's one of those Victorian books where like there's lots of anti-Semitism on the page, and it's mostly in dialogue and like characters' thoughts, and it's like a little bit criticised by Anthony Trollope's authorial voice, but like not very much. So I think that is worth being aware of if you're going into the book. But anyway, I'm glad that I finally reread Rachel Ray. So one book I read in October, which I absolutely loved, a real highlight of the month for me, was this. This is The McDermotts of Ballycloran by Anthony Trollope. I am trying to make my way through all of Anthony Trollope's novels, and I'm so nearly there. I have 4 left, and I'm just about to start another one. I don't think I'm going to quite manage to finish off all of his novels by the end of the year, which had been my plan, but hopefully I'll finish all of his books by early 2026. And yeah, this was actually Anthony Trollope's debut novel, and I thought it was really fantastic. So this is a book from the 1840s, and it's set in the 1830s in Ireland, and it looks at 2 people, a brother and sister, who are from the middle classes. They are landowners, but none of their tenants can really afford to pay them any rent, so they don't really have any money either. And both of them are sort of in danger of falling into bad circumstances in quite different ways. And we're looking at these 2 siblings increasingly being drawn into these dangerous circumstances and the efforts of their local priest, Father John, to help them. I thought this book was fantastic. Just a really, really powerful, gripping novel with a lot of fascinating social criticism. As I said, this book is set in the 1830s in Ireland, but it was published during the 1840s, during the Irish famine. And Anthony Trollope writes a lot in this book about the extreme poverty that many were in Ireland, and especially how that was exacerbated by the prejudices of English landowners or Protestant landowners to Catholic tenants, and so on. And I think that is a really interesting element in this book. There are certain events in the second half of this novel which are so dramatic and really powerfully done. And I love the character of Father John, who's sort of the moral heart of this book, and who is trying so hard to save his friends and to help these 2 young people. And I thought he was a really interesting character. And within himself, Father John is there as a criticism to a lot of prejudices and a lot of anti-Catholic prejudices which existed within Victorian society. So I thought he was done really well, and I just thought this novel was great. So I would highly, highly recommend The McDermotts of Ballycloran. Like a top tier Trollope, I would say. A really, really fantastic Trollope novel. Really worth your time. Do go and read it. It was so great. And yeah, I loved this. I also read, as I said earlier, an Anthony Trollope book in December, and that was Castle Richmond. I started this in November, finished off in December, and just loved it. I mean, I always love Anthony Trollope. I think he's a wonderful writer, but Castle Richmond is a really fascinating one. So this book is set in Ireland during the Irish famine, and I feel like the way the famine is written about is fascinating, really tough. Like, there are some of the most distressing, upsetting scenes I've ever encountered in, I was about to say in an Anthony Trollope novel, but to be honest, in any Victorian novel, are in Castle Richmond. The main plot of Castle Richmond doesn't focus on the famine, though that is a kind of constant background throughout the book. But the main plot focuses on 2 upper-class families living in Ireland, a countess and her 2 children, and a baronet and his family. And we know from the beginning that the baronet has a secret. He has a secret trouble that is slowly driving him mad. And the question, of course, is at first, what is that secret, which you end up knowing quite early on, and then what on earth are they going to do about it? And everything goes on from there. Anthony Trollope is, I think, an incredible writer. And I think his characterization is just incredible. And some of the characters in Castle Richmond were just so well done. The Countess of Desmond was a real highlight for me because she's a really, really complex character. And I feel like Anthony Trollope is very, very good at creating these sort of dislikable, very, very flawed characters that you feel for. And she was definitely one of them. And I just thought it was great. I just thought it was so good. Anthony Trollope is one of those writers where whenever I pick up a book by Anthony Trollope, I'm like, oh, why isn't everything I read Anthony Trollope? I should just read Anthony Trollope all the time. And obviously that's not the case, and I do want more variation in my reading, but I just love Anthony Trollope. What more do I have to say? He's great. I now have 3 books by Anthony Trollope left to read before I finish all of his books. I also read an Anthony Trollope novel in January, and that was Marion Fay, which I absolutely adored. I loved this so much. I thought this was incredible. A top tier Anthony Trollope, in my opinion. So interestingly, I did this as a buddy read, and the other 2 readers I read it with were not as keen as I was. So, you know, maybe only a top tier Anthony Trollope for me. So within Marion Fay, there is a Marquis, and the Marquis has two children, two grown-up children. And he also has a second wife and some younger children with her. And the Marquis in his younger days was sort of relatively liberal-minded and believed in sort of more equality than, you know, existed within Victorian Britain. And his children have kind of taken on those views that he brought them up with, but his new wife very much does not share those views and is very sort of old-fashioned and aristocratic in her views. And perhaps also the Marquis is more old-fashioned than he likes to think himself. And the drama of Marion Fay is largely about what happens when both his two grown-up children fall in love with people who are from far below them in the social scale. So we know from the very beginning of the book that the young lady of the house, Lady Frances, has fallen in love with a post office clerk, and later on in the book, Lord Hampstead, the son of the Marquis, meets and falls in love with a young woman called Marion Fay. And Marion Fay and George Roden are both sort of from the lower middle classes, and Lady Frances and Lord Hampstead's family do not approve. And the book kind of follows the course of these love stories, but there are quite a lot of elements that come into play later in the book that I think are, in a way, what makes this book so great, but also I don't really want to tell you about because I don't want to spoil the book for you. But I thought Marion Fay was amazing. I mean, I love Anthony Trollope always. I love his writing style, and I find his books like just such an utter pleasure to read. And my emotional investment level in Anthony Trollope's books is like always pretty high, but my goodness, was it so high in Marion Fay. I would highly recommend it. I think it was fantastic. I've got 2 Anthony Trollope novels left now before I've read all 47. The other Victorian book I read in March was The Landleaguers by Anthony Trollope, which was not a big success with me. This is one of my least favourite Anthony Trollope books, which is very sad now that I'm really nearing the end of his body of work. So I have now read 46 out of Anthony Trollope's 47 novels. I have one left, John Caldigate, which I'm going to read in April. I'm very excited for it. I really hope I will like it, because I did not really like The Landleaguers that much. So I think there's a few reasons why I sort of have come away from this book with lots of negative feelings. One is that it is an unfinished novel, which I did know going into it. But I think there were like 12 chapters left. So it's a sort of decent length, but Anthony Trollope had quite a lot left to write, and then he passed away and didn't get to finish it. And there are some plot lines where you can see how they're going to be resolved, but there are other plot lines where you can't. And because he's just sort of finished writing it, it just like abruptly ends in the middle of a chapter. So it's a very unsatisfying unfinished novel. And, you know, I think there are some unfinished novels that I really would recommend reading, such as The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens, because it's so good, or Wives and Daughters by Elizabeth Gaskell, because it's only like missing a few pages. It's basically finished. It's fine. But The Landleaguers is probably not an unfinished novel I would hugely recommend, because I don't think it's Trollope's strongest work. Otherwise, it's also definitely one of his works that has like aged really, really badly. You know, Anthony Trollope was a Victorian person who had been socialised by the prejudices of his day. And in some of his novels, he really fights against the prejudices of his day. And in this novel, he just indulges in them, which I did find quite frustrating. So there's 2 sort of plot lines in this book, and both of them had an element in them that I struggled with. So one of the plot lines is about a young woman who is trying to make it as an opera singer in London. And it's about her sort of struggles for financial independence, and also the way women in her position were treated in the Victorian period. Her music teacher, who is in a way her business partner, is attracted to her and, you know, constantly making advances to her that she doesn't want, and her struggles with that is sort of an interesting element of the plot. But her music teacher is Jewish, and the anti-Semitism with which he is written and the anti-Semitism with which she approaches him, like, it's very difficult reading. And I think especially, like, having read Anthony Trollope's book, Nina Balatka, which is a book fighting against anti-Semitism and being really critical of anti-Semitism, it's a bit frustrating that he wrote this later on in life. And then the other half of the plot is set in Ireland and is about the Land League and about disputes and rising tension over land in Ireland. And it's very historically interesting, but I did find that, like, Anthony Trollope's stance was frustrating me in places. And like I said, because this novel isn't finished, I don't know how it would have ended. Like, I don't know exactly what Anthony Trollope was going to do with certain plot lines there. But I do think, like, especially having read a few months ago, The Macdermots of Ballycloran, Anthony Trollope's first novel, this being his last one, Anthony Trollope's first novel, The Macdermots of Ballycloran, is also set in Ireland. And in The Macdermots of Ballycloran, young Anthony Trollope was so clearly trying to fight against English prejudices about Irish Catholics in a way that I found like really, you know, really refreshing for a Victorian novel. And then in the Landleaguers, he is not doing that. And I feel like I prefer younger Anthony Trollope, passionate for social justice, than older, prejudiced Anthony Trollope. But as I say, also the novel's unfinished, so there may have been things that he was going to do towards the end of the novel that were going to resolve some of those things. I don't know. I just struggle with this book. Yes, it's not that it's not worth reading. There are some really interesting things. I would say that if you want to read a book about the Landleaguers and the Land League in Ireland in the 1880s, a much better book for that is Drama and Muslin by George Moore, which I thought was really good and really interesting. And it was quite a long time ago that I read that, but I found that a much more like complicated take on it than the Landleaguers. I feel like I've been rambling about this for a really long time, but basically this was not my favourite Anthony Trollope. And that makes me very sad because I love Anthony Trollope so much. Obviously there were bits I enjoy because it's Anthony Trollope, I love his writing, there were good bits of the love story, etc. But I just, yeah, not my favourite. Something else I read in April was John Caldigate, my final novel by Anthony Trollope. So I've now read all of his 47 books. In my mind, this happened ages ago because I've made so many videos talking about this already. But it was in April that I finished reading John Caldigate. And yeah, this was fantastic. I'm very glad that I finished with this one because it was a really, really strong read. John Caldigate begins with a young man called John Caldigate who has got into debt at university, kind of got into a bit of trouble, and he decides he's going to go to Australia in order to try and make his fortune in the gold mines. So he goes out to Australia, and I initially thought the whole book was going to be him in Australia, but actually that's only sort of the first quarter. Really, the novel is about what happens when he comes back to England from Australia and how choices he made when living in Australia end up impacting his life back in England very drastically. And it's a really difficult book to talk about without spoilers. It's so good, but the things that make it really interesting and that are like, oh, I wasn't expecting to find that in this Victorian novel. To speak about those things would be massive spoilers, but it is such a fascinating book and it's a very different Victorian novel. Really, really compelling, like an absolute page turner. I was so like curious to see what was going to happen, and Anthony Trollope does some very clever things with like what he does and doesn't tell the reader, and it's just great. I just thought John Caldigate was a really, really strong Anthony Trollope novel, but I would highly, highly recommend. And yes, a lovely one to finish off my 10.5-year project of reading all of the works of Anthony Trollope. So there we go. Hello again, we're back with Katie in the present in May 2026. I hope this video has been helpful. As I said, I'm not really expecting that people will have watched it all the way through, but I do hope it will nonetheless be a useful and interesting sort of resource for people to find a review of whatever Anthony Trollope novel they're looking for. I will also leave link down in the description. I do have longer video reviews of Who Knew Who Was Right and also the Barchester Chronicles and the Palliser novels, so I'll leave them linked down below as well. And otherwise, that's all for now. Thank you very much for watching. As ever, if you have any questions about Anthony Trollope, leave them down below because I am pulling together an Anthony Trollope FAQ. That's all for now. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.